one we're going to talk about is joint structure and function, and also the classification of the joints. So basically, we're talking about the human motion, and when we talk about the human motion, the motion in human body is produced at joints. So it is very important for us to understand the joint structure and the classification. Okay, I hope that by this time you have learned about joints in detail in your anatomy class. But this is going to be just a brief overview because the next content that we are going to talk about is how the motion is produced in the joint and some rules regarding the motion production at the joint. So it is important to know that what type of joints we are working with and what are the types of basically joints. So joint is basically a structure where two bones meet each other. Loosely, we classify a joint into three categories. One is the synarthrosis. Okay, these ones here. These are the ones that are fibrous joints. Okay, so these are the connections between the bones, and these are the joints which with basically no movement. Okay, so some of the examples are like the sutures of your skull. Another example is gum fossils, like like your gums, and your tooth, the tooth socket where your tooth is fixed. Basically this joint is meant to be non-motional. There shouldn't be any motion. Think about having a motion in your sutures, and your meninges getting affected because of that. So this is a very particular joint, where you don't need any motion. If there is any motion in these types of joint, then that's a pathology. Okay, like for example, if your tooth starts moving in your gum, then that's a problem. Okay, then the second type we have is called amphiarthrosis. These joints have slight movement, and these are some of the examples of these are, for example, the joint of your vertebral disc, that is basically between the two vertebral bodies. If this is a vertebral body and this is a vertebral body, this disc in between, is your basically amphiarthrosis joint. There is slight movement in this joint. Another one example is your pubic symphysis. So these are some of the joints of that have slight movement. But the primary type of joints that we are dealing with, since we are talking about the human motion and we are talking about the analysis of the motion, we are talking about these types of joints. These are called diarthrosis. They are also called synovial joints. Okay, we'll talk about these in some detail, and we'll discuss what type of synovial joints are there, and what types of diarthrotic joints are there. These joints have a specific they have very specific structure in them. Like for example, they have a synovial cavity, they have a synovial membrane, and they have a lining of synovial membrane, they have articular cartilage, they have surface of the bones, that are connecting with each other through the ligamentous structures, and this joint is enclosed by a capsule. So sometimes they also have menisci in there. So they have a lot of structure in there, that makes them a very applicable joint, or very conducive for motion. Like for example, they have synovial fluid in there. You'll think about, like, why there is a fluid inside a joint. There is definitely a fluid inside the joint to make that movement easy, to decrease the friction between the two bones. So that's why you have a fluid. For similar reasons, you have a cartilage, in between the joint, that helps to reduce the friction. You have a menisci, and then at the same time you need some stability that is provided by the ligaments around that joint, so that at the same time you're having movement, but you're also having a stable movement here there. So these are some of the salient features of synovial joints or diarthrotic joints. These joints also have blood supply, they have innervation, they also have in their ligaments, they also have proprioceptors, around the joint and the capsule and in their ligaments, and they have mechanoreceptors that provide the sensory input. And for example, sometimes, like in the ankle joint, when the lateral ligament is injured, then you also have proprioceptive deficits, because that ligament contains proprioceptions, and then there is a balance problem after that. So these are some of the salient features of your synovial joints. Okay, sometimes they would have bursa, sometimes they would have labrum. So all of these structures are there to make them movement conducive. So since we are talking about synovial joints, since we are talking about biomechanics, we'll talk about synovial joints here. These are some of the examples that I have already discussed. In arthrosis, immovable, your sutures and your gums, that we have talked about. Then amphiarthrosis, you have pubic symphysis, and we also talked about that, vertebral bodies. And then you have the diarthrotic joints, for example, the ankle joint and the knee joint here. These are basically your freely movable joints, and diarthrotic joints. So let's talk about the diarthrotic joints in a little bit and see the different classification of this. So diarthrotic joints have different classification. You have a pivot type of a joint. It's a uniaxial joint. Where this is basically your atlantoaxial C1 C2 joint. This uniaxial joint is basically just joint that allows the pivoting movement. There is a circular movement that takes place in this type of a joint. And another example is your proximal radioulnar joint, where there is a spinning motion, and by now that the spinning motion is around the vertical axis. Okay, so that's that. Then you have a famous ball and socket joint. That's your shoulder joint and your hip joint. So ball and socket joint is the most movable joint in our body. By that I mean, this joint has movements in 3 planes of motion. You have abduction, adduction, you have flexion, extension, you have the rotational motion. So all 3 planes of the all 3 planes and 3 axes are utilized in this type of joint. Okay. And then you have a hinge type of a joint. Hinge type of a joint is the example of that is your elbow joint. So this hinge type of joint, as the name says, it's only one axial or uniaxial. It resembles a door hinge, and your humeroulnar joint or the elbow joint is one of the examples, and your interphalangeal joints are another example of the hinge type of a joint. Then you have another joint that is your ellipsoid joint. So ellipsoid joint is a joint, for example, where you don't have a curvature like ball, so it's only like ellipsoid, and the example for that is your wrist joint, where you have in the wrist primarily your radiocarpal joint, where your radius is actually articulating with your carpal bones, and it has a convex surface that articulates with the concave surface. So these type of joints are bipolar joints. Okay, and bipolar means that they have movement in only 2 axes and 2 planes, usually flexion, extension, and abduction. In adduction we don't usually see rotation in these joints. And then another one you have is a saddle type of a joint. Your cardinal example, your famous example of a saddle type of a joint is your thumb. Okay, your carpometacarpal joint of the thumb, to be very precise, is your saddle type of a joint. So saddle type of a joint just basically means, think about a saddle, and this basically means that you have one concave surface and you have one convex surface. Okay. The movement in this type of joints is also biplanar or biaxial. They have 2 planes and 2 axes of rotation. The important thing is that this is a unique type of a joint, saddle joint. When we talk about the concave convex rule, we have to be very specific about this joint regarding which surface is moving. So that's important to know that the surface that is moving, the concave convex rule is based on that surface. So we might have both convex and concave surfaces, concave rules in this, depending upon the motion. We'll talk more about this in hand biomechanics. And then you have the gliding joint. It's also called planar joint or plane joints. Okay, like for example, this one is called plane joint. Why they're called plane joint? Because their surfaces are plane. There is very less curvature in their surfaces, and that's the reason that in these plane joints, I'm telling you a very important thing, that in these plane joints the concave convex rule is not applicable. Okay. And the example for this is intercarpal joints or intertarsal joints. So these are just plain joints. They glide with each other. There is not much movement. There's only gliding that is present. That's why they're also called gliding joints. One joint that is missed here that is similar to the ellipsoid joint. Sometimes both of them are used interchangeably, but it's slightly different. It's a biaxial joint as well, and this type of joint is called condyloid joint. So basically the joint that is formed by the condyles with the articulating concave surfaces. So they also have biaxial, biplanar movement, flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction. Okay. So yeah, mostly spherical convex surface and paired with the concave surfaces. The major example is this one, that is your tibiofemoral joint. and that's part of your knee joint, okay, tibiofemoral joint. Okay, so almost finished in 10 minutes. Now I'll see you in the next video with the mechanics of the joints. Thank you very much.